The argument here is that the policy in the U.S. in particular, the policy in the U.S. appears to be to basically convalesce in place if you contract COVID until you are sick enough to go to the hospital, at which point we deploy various remedies. And the position that this journalist takes is that, in fact, this is an absurd response because what we have, which Americans are largely unaware of, is a large body of information about treatments that are highly effective at reducing harm, both preventing people from getting COVID and reducing the harm when they do get COVID, and that this has somehow fallen by the wayside. And I will argue that this is because what we have is a system in which our narrative surrounding everything has been politicized, and that this has resulted in basically a run-of-the-mill kind of corruption that causes the narrative to be bent to various people's desires. And this is not only affecting our discussion about vaccines, which we will get to shortly, but it is directly affecting both the policy surrounding when we treat people. In other words, do we wait till you're sick enough to go to the hospital, or do we treat you up front? And basically the argument is, if you're somebody very important, you're going to get medical treatment right away. We will treat you with things that work, and you will miraculously have a mild case. But if you are a commoner, you will get very, very sick before that happens, or you will recover. And so the argument here is that remdesivir, which is the gold standard in standard channels, is actually not a very effective drug at all. It is at best mildly effective, reduces the course of infection by a couple of days.
But it's expensive. It does have that going for it.
It does have that going for it. Whereas
Ivermectin
appears to be highly effective. It is a drug with a long safety record. I was going to read.
So yeah, I have a couple here that I want to
You want to read something?
Yeah,
okay,
maybe it won't be the same thing you had found, but maybe it will be. So you can show it if you want, Zach. You don't have to. Just one paragraph early on, not directly related to what you were talking about, Brett. This fixed narrative has led YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook to practice a new and insidious form of censorship under the dictum that emerging studies are fatally flawed and fostered by fringe elements. Quote, there's no evidence that ivermectin has been proven a safe or effective treatment against COVID-19, declared an Associated Press fact-checking article. Similar reports regurgitate government pronouncements that journalism, at its best, ought rather question. And then down below, we have this section on ivermectin. 3 paragraphs I'm going to read. In a 2011 article, the scientist who discovered ivermectin in 1975 in a patch of Japanese soil, Satoshi Omura, called it astonishingly safe and, quote, a wonder drug, akin to penicillin and aspirin. After more than 25 years of use, a review in the Journal of Drugs and Dermatology concluded, ivermectin continues to provide a high margin of safety. But the U.S. Food and Drug Administration seems bent on ignoring both safety and efficacy findings. In a Q&A on ivermectin, the agency lists side effects from nausea and swelling to neurological events and liver injury. FLCCC President Dr. Pierre Corey described the list for me as, quote, purposefully alarmist. Indeed, despite more than 40 positive studies on ivermectin for COVID, the FDA seems stuck in a time warp. Its website calls the Australian study from 8 months ago recently released, while still declaring, without acknowledging newer studies, that additional testing is needed. That's fine, if only there was support. Just 3 studies on ivermectin are proceeding in the United States, and none is funded by the National Institutes of Health or any other U.S. agency.
Yeah, I find this absolutely stunning. Here's another section I thought was pretty remarkable. For 25 years, ivermectin has been distributed free in 19 African countries to control parasites. Is it a coincidence that those countries had 28% fewer COVID deaths and 8% fewer cases than 35 other African nations? Is it a coincidence that the 240 million resident Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, which distributes free ivermectin, has a COVID death rate that is 1/16 that of the United States?
1/60th.
Sorry, I'm reading very small font.
Yeah, it is.
So are those things conclusive? They are not, because you have an uncontrolled environment, but they are certainly provocative. let's see, there was another section I wanted to.
Well-
Ivermectin, the most promising COVID treatment to date, won its developers the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2015 and a place in the World Health Organization's model list of essential medicines. Since the 1980s, with billions of doses given, the drug has cured crippling tropical diseases that had devastated African countries while curbing scabies, lice, and protecting livestock and dogs from parasites. Spurred by pre-COVID studies showing ivermectin killed Zika and other viruses, Australian researchers last spring tested the drug in a petri dish where it obliterated coronavirus in 48 hours. Since then, more than 36 studies have shown good results in preventing and treating COVID-19. To be sure, some of the results sound too good to be true and are based on small patient samples. Others are available only in online drafts and have not been officially published. But 16 studies have been peer-reviewed, and 11 are randomized controlled trials that compared patients who did and did not get the drug. So that is all very provocative. Now,
Sure is.
what I believe is emerging, and I don't know quite how to cast it, has nothing to do with ivermectin and remdesivir or vaccines in particular. It is a more general malady where...
Before you do that, can we just finish this off
Sure.
before you go into more general malady? This paper that you were just reading from links to this site, Zach, and it is called, it's just a COVID-19 basically clearinghouse site, which is done anonymously. Let's see, I had found the facts before. I don't see them here. Here. Frequently asked questions about this site says we're a bunch of researchers who aren't interested in going public, but we are basically just putting together evidence for a number of different drugs that are currently being used to treat. This is not about the vaccines. It's about drugs for treatment rather than vaccines for prevention. And their collated information on ivermectin here shows tremendously, and this is a complicated page, I'm not going to walk us through what it is, but this page is still up, c19ivermectin.com, and you can go through, efficacy across lots of studies of ivermectin, vitamin D, hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and remdesivir, which has much lower efficacy. But interestingly and fairly appallingly, what we find is I now can't find the site that, here we go. Twitter suspended the account that was being used to basically publicize this work at COVID Analysis on December 27th. And there's no explanation or response from Twitter as to why. What exactly on this page is dangerous? It is a collation of extant research on a number of possible treatments for the scourge that is threatening to wipe out people and economics across the entire world. What exactly is so dangerous about this?
Right. And why does Twitter think that it is expert enough to decide whether or not we are able to look at this and discuss it, right? Who the hell are they?
Yeah. And so the site is still up, but the Twitter account is not.
Yeah. So what I wanted to argue is that what we find evidence for across the board, anywhere where we take the narrative that we are handed and we scrutinize it with tools that we happen to have because we're biologists, right? Obviously, we're not epidemiologists. Mm-hmm. We're not virology specialists, mm-hmm. right? But the point is basic scientific literacy, a willingness to dive into these things. What we find again and again is that the narrative that we are being handed and the narrative we see being enforced on social media is itself garbage and politicized. And one can deduce what its purpose is by virtue of the fact that clearly it is willing to harm people in order to keep the message simple and on track. In other words, why, all else being equal, why would the narrative center around remdesivir, a drug that has dubious effectiveness, and systematically shun ivermectin when the safety and efficacy appears to suggest exactly the reverse would be wise? That is a preposterous thing for it to do, and the obvious result is that people will be harmed, right? We should be thinking about treating COVID treating COVID is almost certainly a good way to prevent people from communicating COVID. And so, there's no way in which this is responsible. Or if it is somehow responsible, why are we not allowed to have the discussion that then will inevitably reach that conclusion, because we will discover the reason that remdesivir is the right choice?
And even if these two drugs, ivermectin and remdesivir, had exactly the same results in the variety of research that's been done with regard to treating symptoms of COVID-19, the fact that it's ivermectin that has been around, that was discovered in Japanese soil in the 1970s, apparently, and has been used in millions of people for other conditions, and therefore has an decades-long history of studies of safety of places where it's not, presumably, we should prefer that drug, all else being equal, over a newer one. Just as if there is a vaccine that is made in the traditional style that is available, all else being equal, we should prefer that over an mRNA vaccine, simply because there is no way, proclamations from scientists notwithstanding, to know whether or not the new technology is safe yet. We simply cannot know.
Right. We, the public, right? We who are united against COVID and its transmission ought to prefer that. On the other hand, there's a very small group that might have exactly the opposite incentive.
Oh, gee, who could they be?
Well, and we see this all the time in pharmaceutical development, where basically patent protection expires on a drug, and either a new drug that isn't any better is introduced because it's patented,
it's got a little
or some little tweak
on.
has been made in order to make these things more profitable. And the fact is, this is just a place where markets do a piss poor job of managing the public health. So anyway, we see this all over the place. And so I don't know what the patent situation is for ivermectin, but my guess is, given that description of how long it's been around, probably cheap and readily, generics available.
And just one other line of evidence to support that is if it is really being deployed at the millions of people level across Africa, it's probably not a super expensive drug to be producing or to be giving out.
Excellent point. And the other thing is, it has generated exactly the natural experiments that would allow you to deduce pattern. In other words, the fact that you've got a bunch of different African countries, I think it was 18 of them had widespread and 30 some odd that didn't. That allows you, it doesn't mean that that's why the 18 seem to outperform the 30 some, but it's a strong indication, and that itself is a testable hypothesis. So there's lots of landscape to look at in order to figure out what is actually going on and what it says about what we should do.